Evolution. It's been called many things. Fact. Proven. The foundation of life science. Denying it has been equated to denying the existence of gravity. As a creationist, some call me crazy and ask me how I can possibly ignore the mountain of evidence that supports evolution. Well, my friends, today we are going to pay a visit to Mount Evolution. Before we approach this mountain, we need the right equipment. Evolution is taught as scientific fact, but before we discuss whether or not evolution is science, we need to discuss what is science. In science, you make an observation, form a hypothesis based on what you observed, test that hypothesis with an experiment, then analyze the results of that experiment to see if they confirm or refute your hypothesis. This is known as the scientific method. Here's a hypothetical example. A farmer might observe that certain parts of his field, the crops are yielding larger fruit. He might hypothesize that his larger fruits are only larger because the soil around them is less acidic. He would then conduct an experiment to test that hypothesis. He could grow crops at varying levels of soil acidity, then measure the size of the fruit at each condition. He would then analyze the results of the test to determine if they confirm or refute his hypothesis. In this particular graph, we see that the fruit actually grew larger in more acidic soil conditions. He hypothesized that fruit would grow larger in less acidic soil. However, his experiment has demonstrated the opposite to be true. The conclusion of his experiment is that his hypothesis is refuted. To answer the question, what is science? Science is observation, experimentation, and measurement. If you can't observe it, experiment on it, and measure it, then it's not science. Evolution has not been observed. No experiments have ever demonstrated evolution occurring, and because of this, evolution has not been measured. If evolution lacks observation, experimentation, and measurement, can we call it science? Here's a picture of Mount Evolution. It contains the 6 most common building blocks of their belief. Let's examine evolution's most fundamental argument, abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is the belief that all organic life evolved from inorganic chemicals. Abiogenesis teaches that simple elements combined with water and energy to form more complex chemicals, which then formed amino acids, which eventually resulted in living cells. The most commonly cited experiment of abiogenesis was performed by Stanley Miller and Miller-Urey in 1953. This experiment aimed to demonstrate that a combination of water, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and energy was enough to create all life on Earth, no divine intervention necessary. So Miller and Urey combined those chemicals in a manner that mimics what they assumed Earth's early conditions were. Some amino acids were created in the experiment. Evolutionists cite this experiment as proof that life can evolve from non-living materials. But this experiment had several flaws. First, Miller and Urey assumed to know Earth's early conditions, which is impossible without direct observation. The amino acids that they created in their experiment are not found in living things. Thus, they are irrelevant to the origins of living things. And third, producing an amino acid is insufficient to produce life, because amino acids alone do not create an organism. Instructions from DNA are required for amino acids to build functional organisms. We know from observation that DNA only comes from living organisms. In other words, DNA and amino acids must exist at the same time for life to occur. This was not observed in Miller's experiment. Without its foundational argument, Mount Evolution is not doing so well. Now let's talk about dating methods. Evolutionists like to use 2 main dating methods to prove that the Earth is millions of years old. There's carbon dating and radiometric dating. Carbon dating is used to determine the age of fossils. It works by measuring the ratio of carbon-14 and carbon-12 in the fossil. Living animals continue to absorb carbon-14 until they die. After death, they cease to absorb carbon-14, and the carbon-14 remaining in their bodies degrades into carbon-12. Paleontologists assume that a fossil with a higher ratio of carbon-12 has been dead longer than a fossil with a higher ratio of carbon-14 because the older fossil has had a longer period of time to produce that carbon-12. Carbon dating is flawed. The original amount of carbon-14 in the animal when it died was not observed. If you don't know the original amount of carbon-14 that was in the animal, you can't compare it to the current amount of carbon-14 in its fossil to determine the total amount of carbon-14 lost over time. If you cannot determine the total amount of carbon-14 that was lost, you cannot determine the age of the fossil. The original amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is also unobserved. In addition, the amount of contamination the fossil could have incurred over time is also unobserved. Remember, measurement is key to science. You need to compare the amount of carbon-14 measured in the living specimen with the amount of carbon-14 measured in the dead specimen to determine how much carbon-14 the animal lost. You need both measurements to determine the age of the fossil. Without the ability to know the original amount of carbon-14 in the animal, you are unable to determine its age. Similarly, radiometric dating determines the ages of rocks by measuring the ratio of uranium to lead. Through radioactive decay, uranium becomes lead over time. Paleontologists compare the ratio of uranium and the ratio of lead to determine the age of the rock. This method of dating has the same flaws as carbon dating. The original amount of uranium when the rock first formed is unobserved. The rate of radioactive decay when the rock first formed is also unobserved. Without these observations, it's impossible to know the total amount of uranium in the rock. Without knowing the total amount of uranium in the rock, it's impossible to determine how much uranium the rock has lost. If you don't know how much uranium the rock has lost, you cannot use this method to determine the age of the rock. This is not even counting the possibility that groundwater sources can interfere with the concentration of certain minerals in the rock. So let's recap all the flaws in dating methods. There's a lack of direct observation of the original animal during fossilization. There's a lack of direct observation of the original rock during its formation. And also, there's a lack of observation of past decay rates. Finally, there's a lack of direct observation of the original amount of C14 in the atmosphere at the time of fossilization. Without direct observation, can we call these dating methods science? The answer is no. Now on to mutations. Evolutionists teach that various errors in the DNA replication process of a simple organism allowed it to mutate and become more and more complex. This is how they believe that the single-cell organism evolved into all of the diverse and complex life forms we see today. But since this is science class, we must refer to what has been observed. Consider the single-celled organism. It has the DNA to make a cell membrane, its organelles, and a nucleus. A human, on the other hand, is more complex because our DNA makes far more features, such as skin, nerve, bone, and muscle. When a single-celled organism replicates, it produces more single-celled organisms with membranes, organelles, and nuclei, nothing more. With each new generation of single-celled organism, there may be some slight differences in key features, such as how well the cell membrane functions or the shape of the cell, but those differences alone have not been observed to add new features to the cell, such as skin, nerve, and bone. No mutations have been observed that add information to the DNA of an organism and allow it to become another type of organism. Now, I know a lot of hands will go up and you'll say, what about antibiotic-resistant bacteria? You may have read a newspaper article that said the fact that bacteria can suddenly adapt to antibiotics somehow proves evolution on a small scale. However, the problem with this argument is that new genetic information is not required for a species to demonstrate a new ability. There are two ways in which an organism can show a new ability without becoming a new type of organism. The first possibility is that that so-called new ability already existed within the population of that organism, and that all of the individuals in that population that lacked this ability were weeded out. Let's talk about the bacteria again, because antibiotic-resistant bacteria have been a huge problem in the hospital setting. Antibiotic resistance may seem like a feature that the bacteria recently adapted in order to fight the antibiotics. However, some bacteria in the wild are naturally antibiotic resistant without having encountered antibiotics. So let's say this black oval here represents an environment that's mostly populated with bacteria that are vulnerable to antibiotics, with a few antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the background. In this picture, the red circles represent bacteria that are naturally resistant to antibiotics, and the blue circles represent bacteria that are vulnerable to antibiotics. If I introduce an antibiotic into this environment, it will kill off most of the vulnerable bacteria, leaving only the resistant ones behind. With more space and less competition for resources, the resistant bacteria will gradually become the dominant bacteria in the environment. This would create the illusion that the vulnerable bacteria suddenly evolved in response to the antibiotics. But in reality, the vulnerable bacteria were exterminated and replaced by the resistant bacteria. So as you can see, bacteria are not evolving in response to antibiotics. The vulnerable bacteria are just being weeded out in favor of the resistant bacteria. The second way in which a species can demonstrate a new ability without the kind of mutation evolutionists suggest is through a loss of function. Consider carriers of sickle cell anemia. A portion of their blood cells are irregularly shaped. They are resistant to malaria because their irregularly shaped blood cells stimulate the production of certain enzymes that prevent the spread of malaria throughout their body. This may seem like humans developing a new ability and evolving in response to disease, and it may seem to support evolution, but in reality, this seeming advantage actually results from a loss of proper function in their blood cells. In addition, they carry the increased risk of passing a life-threatening disease to their children. Evolutionists claim that organisms can mutate and become more complex, and that's how we go from microbes to microbiologists. But what has been observed? We have seen new abilities in species where no new genetic information was added. We've seen the loss of functionality give the illusion of a new ability, and no mutations that increase genetic information on an organism and allow it to become another kind of organism have ever been observed. So far, Mount Evolution is doing pretty badly. We just debunked its foundational arguments. Now let's talk about the fossil record. Evolutionists like to argue that the fossil record proves that the Earth is millions of years old, that all organisms have common ancestry, and that dinosaurs predate man by millions of years. Finally, they like to argue that all dinosaurs gradually died due to mass extinction by comets. Let's talk about their first claim, that fossils prove the Earth is millions of years old. As we've discussed earlier, carbon dating cannot be used to prove that a fossil is millions of years old because the original amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere and in the animal when it died are unobserved. But what is observed? When an animal dies, it undergoes decomposition. Scavengers, decomposing bacteria, sunlight radiation, heat, and erosion all act on an animal carcass to break it down into dirt. We've observed that all parts of an animal decompose when it dies. Everything in an animal decomposes. Evolutionists claim that the Earth is millions of years old and that dinosaurs died millions of years ago. If the Earth was millions of years old, then millions of years of decomposition, erosion, deposition, and geologic activity actually would predict the absence of fossils. But what do we find? Dinosaur fossils with soft tissue preserved. In order for soft tissue to be preserved, the animal would have to be buried rapidly before decomposition could occur. The fact that fossils with soft tissue exist contradicts the concept of millions of years of geologic processes. Evolutionists also claim that the fossil record proves common ancestry. This is a picture of a phylogenetic tree that we've all seen in our biology textbooks. It groups all organisms by their most recent common ancestor and groups all organisms as descendants of one common ancestor, the single cell. However, the fossil record offers no evidence to support the evolutionist claims that different species share a common ancestor. What has been observed? These transitional species are absent from the fossil record, and most transitional species you'll see in a textbook are artists' interpretations based on non-existent fossils. Others are incomplete fossils that evolutionists have assumed to be transitional species without proper evidence. For example, here is an evolutionary family tree showing the supposed origins of the whale. As you can see, evolutionists believe that the whale began as a dog-like creature which developed webbed feet and eventually became more and more whale-like. However, evolutionists derived this entire argument from a skull fragment and a jaw fragment. They made sweeping assumptions based on limited fossils. This would be like if I found a bolt lying around in a junkyard, and from looking at the bolt, I pretended to know the make, model, and color of the car and the personality of the driver. Would you believe me? No, because I lack the data to substantiate my claims. Evolutionists lack sufficient fossil data to substantiate their claims of common ancestry. And now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the argument that would make any Christian in the room nervous: dinosaurs. Evolutionists claim that fossils prove that dinosaurs predate man by millions of years. This argument assumes two things. One, that the earth is millions of years old, and two, that man had no contact with dinosaurs. But what has been observed? Take a look at this picture. On the top left is an ancient Mesopotamian seal depicting what appears to be a dinosaur, and this seal dates back to about 3100 BC. On the right is an Anasazi Native American painting from 1200 AD depicting what appears to be an Apatosaurus. Finally, on the bottom is an engraving on a Cambodian temple dating back to 1100 AD depicting a Stegosaurus. Well, after paleontologists dug up fossils, we found that Apatosaurus fossils are found in North America. Stegosaurus fossils are found in Asia. And neither culture had access to the same data and excavation equipment we have today. So what is observed? Ancient Americans drew American dinosaurs without the machinery to excavate their fossils. Asians drew Asian dinosaurs without the machinery to excavate their fossils. And fossils have been observed today with soft tissue intact. The conclusion, logically, is that ancient humans encountered live dinosaurs. Evolutionists believe that a comet hit the Earth, which caused so much dust to fly into the sky that plants no longer received sufficient sunlight, causing all herbivorous dinosaurs to die, which caused a breakdown in the food chain, and eventually all dinosaurs died of starvation and disease. However, this explanation is flawed. Mass extinction fails to explain the presence of fossil record given millions of years of decomposing bacteria. In addition, the mass extinction argument of the evolutionists fails to explain the presence of preserved aquatic fossils in mountains. If the Earth is millions of years old and all the dinosaurs died millions of years ago, then why are there preserved fossils in mountains? Should not decomposition have removed all of those fossils? Well, in review of the fossil record, what actually is observed? We see that fossils exist despite decomposition, suggesting that the dinosaurs were buried rapidly before decomposition could occur. We see soft tissue has been preserved in dinosaur fossils despite decomposition. We see a lack of transitional species in the fossil record. We see that dinosaurs were depicted by humans without the machinery to access those fossils. And finally, we see fossilized marine life in mountains. Evolutionists provide insufficient explanations for all of these observations because all of these observations are incompatible with an Earth that is millions of years old. I present the Bible as a superior explanation for all of these observations. The Bible was written by individuals who lived in the same era as the people who made the earliest artwork depicting dinosaurs. Therefore, the authors of the Bible have directly observed the things which we dig up today. So let's look at each of these observations and see how the Bible succeeds where evolutionists fail. The first observation: fossils exist despite decomposition, which suggests a sudden burial. Well, under the evolutionist paradigm, there would have been millions of years passing after the dinosaurs died, which would predict an absence of their fossils due to decomposing bacteria. However, this necessity of rapid burial for fossils to exist is not a problem for Scripture. In Genesis 7, we see that the waters in the flood prevailed upon the earth, which would allow there to be landslides and erosion, and enough mud and clay could have been generated in Genesis 7 to bury all of those living organisms before decomposition occurred. The next observation, that dinosaur fossils have soft tissue preserved in them. Well, this is at odds with the belief that the Earth is millions of years old, because in millions of years you would expect that soft tissue to have fully decayed. However, the Bible argues that the Earth is not millions of years. Thus, the observation is a problem for evolutionists, not for the Bible. The next observation is that there are a lack of transitional species in the fossil record. This would actually be a problem for the evolutionist argument that all organisms share common ancestors, because if these common ancestors exist, where are they? They're not in the fossil record. A problem for evolutionism, but not a problem for Scripture, which argues in Genesis 1 that all organisms do not share common ancestors. The next observation is that dinosaurs are depicted by humans with no machinery to access these fossils. This is a problem for evolutionism because, according to evolutionists, dinosaurs died millions of years before man came on the scene. If that's the case, how is man depicting dinosaurs without the means to excavate the fossils? Well, let's look at history a bit. The word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1841. Before that, the word dragon was used to describe this kind of creature. In Job 30:29, we see that Job has encountered dinosaurs, which demonstrates that man and dinosaur did live together, which fits the evidence where evolutionists fail to meet the evidence. The next observation is marine fossils found in mountains. How did this happen? You would expect that in millions of years these fossils would have decayed and decomposed given millions of years of time. Well, under the Bible we see that in Genesis 8 God has been opening and closing the fountains of the deep, which means God is acting on the plates of the earth to cause plate tectonic shift, the very activity that's responsible for building mountains on our earth. Therefore, the Bible has an explanation as to how fossils could end up in mountains. God caused plate tectonic shift, which allowed the fossils to then be displaced. So yet again, another example where the evidence fits the Bible, but not the evolutionist paradigm. As you can see, the Bible has an explanation that fits all of the observed evidence. On the other hand, all evolutionists have are unfounded, unobserved assumptions. Now let's talk about these so-called ape men. Evolutionists like to argue that fossils of ape-like human ancestors prove that apes and humans have a common ancestor. They also like to argue that similarities between humans and apes proves that humans and apes have a common ancestor. Now, there are several examples evolutionists like to use of human ancestors with ape-like features. However, for the sake of brevity, let's address the most commonly used one, the Australopithecus afarensis, aka Lucy. Lucy is usually depicted with an ape-like upper body, but with human feet and opposable thumbs. But what was observed? What was the evolutionist evidence for their argument? The fossil found had an incomplete skeleton, but the pieces present had ape-like jawbones, ape-like pelvic bones, and no foot bones. Without foot bones, it's impossible for evolutionists to argue that Lucy had human feet. So let's stop and think about this for a second. Evolutionists found a skeleton with ape-like features and no human features. The conclusion is that Lucy is an incomplete ape skeleton. This means that the depiction of Lucy in museums and textbooks is simply artwork based on incomplete evidence and assumptions. This is the exact opposite of science. Evolutionists argue that similarities in the structures of different animals proves that all animals have a common ancestor. However, similar structures in different animals is a problem for the evolutionist view, not the creationist view. Evolutionists believe that random mutation is the driving mechanism behind one species evolving into another. Not only are these mutations unobserved, but the fact that order and similarity are observed between species is evidence against a random process. On the other hand, we creationists believe all animals share a common intelligent creator. An intelligent being is able to generate the order and similarity that you see between the species today, where a random process cannot. Order and similarity between species actually adds weights to the Bible's explanation of origins, not the evolutionist. So let's recap all of the observations. Abiogenesis has not been experimentally observed. Dating methods lack direct observation. Between species mutations are not experimentally observed. The fossil record lacks evidence to validate common ancestry claims. And ape men are just artist reconstructions of incomplete fossils. If evolution is not supported by direct observation, has no experimental validation, and has not been measured, can we really call it science? No. At this point, does it even matter that evolution is accepted by most scientists? Just because multiple people believe in something does not mean that something is correct. This is known as the ad populum fallacy. Thank you for your patience. If you believe in evolution, I hope this has been thought-provoking. And if you are a Christian, I hope this has strengthened you. God bless. Mount Evolution. Talk. Bye.